originator of runes, or being the father of runes.
And this Johannes Burius, I'm sure.
Yeah, Johannes Burius.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Johann. His friends called him Johann Bure, but Johannes Burius, when he was in, that's how they Latinized their name, so that when they wrote in Latin, they could fit their names into the grammar of the language. That's what they were doing there. So that's how they get that. But Johann Bure is good enough. But he's quite a guy. It turns out that he is sort of a role model before I even knew I had one for what I ended up doing in my life, because he was a Rosicrucian, a mystic, a magician, all those things. But he also was one of the first, along with another guy with an even weirder name, Ole Worm, in Denmark. Both of these guys started to figure out really how to read these runic inscriptions that were all over their countries, but nobody knew how to read them anymore. Except farmers or people in very remote areas of Sweden, on the island of Gotland, and in a district north of Stockholm, there were farmers who still knew how to read and write these runes, and that's who this guy went to find out what there are these things about. And then he figured out how to decode these thousands of runic inscriptions that littered his homeland. There are 5,000 of such stones in Sweden alone.
So I know today I have a set that's like made out of lapis lazuli, and you have the basic set that we know today. So apparently they've been cut back and kind of like cut out, or I mean, there's many. You said 5,000. So what brought it down to the basic set that we know today?
Well, there are 5,000 rune stones. That is inscriptions, almost all of which are memorial stones to dead ancestors and so forth, typically translating to something like Gudrun had this stone set up after, meaning in memory of her father. He was a good man. Opier carved the runes, something like that. It's what these things typically read. And you see that these things are not gravestones. They are memorial stones that are set up generally either outside of grave mound sets, family graveyards, if you will, but on a road outside them or near them, or just on public roads where people pass by. Because the point of the stone was, well, to memorialize, but only 1% of the people at the time the stones were carved, it's estimated, only about 1% of the population could read them. These people were really not literate in our sense of trying to use writing for ordinary purposes, but rather they used it for this kind of special mythic kind of religious purpose. And the stone, reading the stone itself, we know from the evidence on many of the stones themselves, was a magical act. If you've ever seen these rune stones or pictures of them, they typically have serpentine design on them, and the runes are carved in the ribbon that the serpent or animal zoomorphic body displays. And so the person reading it has to find out, where does this thing start, and kind of crane their neck around. And it's really a decoding exercise, more than just reading it like we would a book or a piece of paper or whatever. And it would take some time to read it. And at the end of some of them, it gives the reason why all of this is happening that way. And it says, for example, good luck in the pagan times, good luck, hate in Old Norse or Old Swedish, hate sá rist, heit sá reið. Good luck to him who carved them. Good luck to him who is reading them. So it was a boon, a magical charge. But see, it went two ways. It went back to probably a dead man who had carved them in the past. That verb was in the past tense. Good luck to him who carved them. Good luck to him who is now reading them. To you, the reader. And that would be an actual magical blessing, if you will. And then later in Christian times, this didn't stop with Christianity coming. They still carved these stones. And so they would say, God bless him who carved them. God bless him who's reading them. They just changed the form of the blessing, but the really pagan, indigenous, autochthonous rationale for the stones remains. And that is a magical power being conveyed to the other world and back to you.
And when it comes
so there's more to them.
Oh, okay. Yeah. When it comes
there's more to them than it appears.
When it comes to revivals, and I know you talked about Christianity, did they try to kind of like wipe them off the earth and then they'd come back? Did they always try to suppress it?
Not in the beginning. Not in the beginning. With the Catholic in the Catholic age, of course, Scandinavia, it's very curious as far as religious history is concerned. The last regions of Europe to be converted to Christianity were the first ones to throw it off. Sweden, for example, where we've been talking about mainly, wasn't converted to Christianity until 1100. Okay, and by 1500, they went Protestant as soon as they could. Which in Protestantism, one of the main political aspects of it was that the king, the monarch of the land, becomes the chief religious figure. In England today, the Queen is called the defender of the faith. She's really the highest religious authority in the country as well as secular. And that is typical of Protestant countries. But that's also typical of pagan past, whereas the Catholic medieval order of the universe was supposed to be, you have the Pope, who's the sacred head, who's the boss, yes, but then we have a king who is a secular enforcer of the religious law and authority, but they're different and separate. So with Protestantism and in Sweden and so forth, they went back as soon as they could to a national church, the Swedish church, the English church, the Danish church, etc. They were national churches as they remain today. But that is interesting that the last ones converted to Christianity were the first ones to rebel against it. And again, in Germany, southern Germany, which had been part of the Roman Empire, remained Catholic, whereas the northern part that was never conquered by the Romans became Protestant. So if you look at a map religious map of Germany, you'll see it almost exactly matches up with where the empire was versus was not. That's the authority of the prestige of Rome and things Roman. So to those people who were part of the empire historically.
So for some reason, I think of Vikings who may have, went to Britain and became Christian, but they were still probably doing the runes in the shadows, so to speak.
Yeah, well, they were pagans when they first invaded England. Of course, in 797, when the Viking Age starts, and they start to make incursions into England, mainly, and also around all of the other British Isles and Ireland and everywhere. There were no towns at all in Ireland when the Vikings came. They established all the towns you see on the map now, the cities were all originally Viking trading posts. But they invaded these areas and colonized them. That's what Led Zeppelin's Immigrant Song is about. That it's about the Vikings coming to England. The West. It says, "We will not cease till we reach the western shore." You can't hardly understand Robert Plant as he sings it, but when you hear somebody else sing it, it's clearer. But they were pagan, so they re-paganized the whole northern part of England. After these invasions started, there was a thing called the Danelaw in northern England, and the Saxon kings had to pay the Danes. That was the only way they could defend themselves against them at certain times, was just to pay them. What if we don't pay them, they'll come and take it, and they'll take the rest of the land also. And then kings like Alfred the Great and others started to push them back. My namesake, Edred, my grandfather's name was Edred, and I was named after him. He was dead by the time I was born, and that's part of Germanic. My parents didn't know it, but they were practicing good Germanic reincarnation theory, naming the children after dead ancestors, and thus causing them to be reborn into the family. Edred was one of the guys that was a real warrior king who was responsible for defeating Eric Bloodaxe in York, But that is all. They were pagans, and then they slowly converted to Christianity, but it was a very slow process there in England. Really, they started to hit them in the rear end, by Christianizing Denmark and Norway and so forth, because the people who were adventurers, they weren't too keen on the idea of Christianity. That's how Iceland really started to be settled out there in this forsaken icy world, because they left Norway, most of them, to get away from Christianization and so forth.
And I know it says Johannes that I guess he started to combine the runes with folklore and Renaissance high magic. Is that where they kind of like link them to gods from Norse mythology, or is that what is it mean by folklore?
That's he sort of, like you said, correct there, high magic, and the sort of he was a Renaissance man, totally educated in the Latinate world and all of that, but the folklore regarding runes continued on among those people who could still use them, those few that I mentioned before. But if we see in Iceland, that's where these people were remembering all of these poems where these things are reported about Odin and his finding of the runes and the whole thing. I know that I hung on a windy tree. All of that. They memorized these poems, so Icelanders actually memorized them. That's what, and then wrote them down when they learned to write in Latin letters. But the figure Snorri Sturluson, the guy who wrote the Edda, which is this book of kind of a textbook of how to write poetry, skaldic poetry in Icelandic for Icelanders, wrote it in 1222. It's full of, that's where we get a very systematic view of pagan Germanic religion. And he codified this and wrote it down in order, really, his ostensible purpose was to keep the pagan lore alive, because you can't, in his estimation, write good poetry about anything else but that. So that's why he wrote this book, to keep this alive. And he wrote the biography of Egil Skalla Grimsson, who's a runic. He's a guy who lived in the 900s. He was warrior and rune magician, and his saga, Egil saga, tells, or gives you a personality really for what a rune magician in the Viking age would have been like, and how he thought, how he his religion, how he related to the gods and other people and so forth. And Snorri Sturluson probably wrote that saga as well.
Well, what are some ways that you would consider like using them for magic? Because I know they engrave them on things and stuff like that. But let's say someone who definitely would be a novice. But what are some ways that they use them that are for magic?
Well, you could, because the people, we are at a great disadvantage when the word I would use technically is operatively. Magic is as operation, how to do things with symbols, how to communicate with the causal world. Let's go back to Egil Skallagrimsson. He, as in one episode, he is in a hall, typical thing like you see in these Viking movies and so forth, and somebody brings him a horn. That's something to drink out of, with ale in it, and he figures, somebody might have put poison in there. So he carves some runes on it. He stabs his hand with that knife that he carved with, and rubs blood on it, says a magic spell over it, and the horn bursts asunder, breaks, explodes. There's poison in there, you see. So that's a perfect example from within that world where we see that these communications make things happen. Mm-hmm. Because, why? Because in one ancient runestone, we get the clue, the key, and that is it's the stone of Nolaby from 600. It says these runes are here, and it says they are derived or descended from the gods. You see, this is the language, the meta language of the gods who can make things happen. But the rune magician, someone who was initiated into this knowledge base and using Odin as role model and God, like Egil Skallagrimsson did over 1,000 years ago, starts to be able to do the same kind of meta communication with the universe using runes. Now, our disadvantage tends to be, as modern current people, is that most people approach the runes as isolated symbols, don't they? I mean, most people, you see books on runes, even my own, Futhark, whatever. It tends to say this rune means these things. That's true. All that's true. But the way they were used and really put into operation was that people wrote not long-winded stuff, but pithy, formulaic communications written in these runes, which were designed to cause things to happen, how to do things with words. But the runes, because they are derived from the gods, as this stone tells us, and Edda talks about it too, and we see how Odin discovered them. He didn't invent them, he discovered them, which are, the word rune means mystery or secret. They are mysteries of the universe, codified into a system originally of 24 signs arranged in 3 rows. It's kind of like a periodic table of meaning. And so we can recombine them. And we, English speakers today, we can still write in runes. In fact, the runic system, most proper to our own language, is the Anglo-Saxon English runic system. And you could write runes very well. I see most people who attempt to write runes and do write in them sometimes almost exclusively use the older Futhark of 24 runes. And of course, people like me who started to write on the runes in 1984, publishing. Ralph Blum doesn't count because he didn't know that there was even a runic, system at all. It was just kind of arbitrary order, and it wasn't really a runic system. But that had such an impact. People just say, "Yeah, those are the runes," and they try to write it. But really, if you wrote English in Anglo-Saxon runes, you have all of the variations of pronunciation that we use. Our language is very archaic in its sound. We make sounds that are very archaic. German has lost most of them. The Scandinavian languages, except Icelandic, have lost most of them. The th and the and the w sound, so those things. Those had runes, and that's kind of interesting. You see, we say W for the w sound. That means there was no Latin letter for that anymore in the Middle Ages. So they had to double the U to make that w sound out of a U, W, or the thorn and the z sound with no Latin letter for that, so they had to do TH. Two letters had to be employed, or the sound. There's a rune for that, but not a Latin letter for it, and so they had to do NG to account for those sounds that weren't there. So runes are made for expressing the language we're speaking right now much better than the Latin alphabet is, which is kind of a makeshift attempt to represent the sounds of our language. So runes are really indigenous to us. And a lot of pilgrims, Christians, but how the identity they had, these Anglo-Saxon pilgrims going to Rome. There's a lot of graffiti there from the Middle Ages where people put their names on walls or wherever in runes. And the reason they did it in runes is that I am English, I am Anglo-Saxon, see? And so that was not only their name as being, this is my identity, but also the way in which I write my name tells you of a community to which I belong. And that was intended as a magical act because they're trying to impress themselves, their being on this location, which is a place of pilgrimage and for saints, whoever, there in Rome. But so there's a magical intent in that form of communication. It's not just graffiti defacing property. It's an attempt to identify oneself and oneself with one's environment. So it's a theory of communication that's being actualized there.
I know it was fascinating in your book how you mentioned some references to the runes, the three central runes to the Truin and Thor, Odin, Frey, and how you kind of paralleled some of the Christian belief system with some like Thor being linked to Jehovah and things like that. That was definitely very fascinating. And what are some of the, I know it's complex, but what are some of those connections? I mean, it seems like there are some strange connections like that are kind of very similar.
The Germanic peoples, or the Celtic peoples, or any peoples, the Afro-Caribbean peoples, etc. They have their Voodoo, they have their Mokumba, they have their Santeria, and all of these things, right? Yes. Wherein the Christian saints and deities and whatever they have are identified with pagan, indigenous, spiritual entities, so that this apparent saint is actually masking a pagan god. And that happens universally when a foreign, just out of nowhere religion is imposed on a people. They don't just, because there were no originally any Sunday schools. No, people were not indoctrinated into Christianity. Only the priests were. The people were expected to be obedient, come to church, take the sacrament, not say things that were wrong, etc. kind of like, you were a Bolshevik or something like that in 1917 Russia. You just got to toe the line. We're getting used to that. Okay. But people weren't educated into it. They were just bludgeoned into it. But people still have religions. They still have religious feeling. They still have traditions and family and home, domestic cult that they carry on. And so the pagan gods just took up residence in the Christian saints in Germany, in Scandinavia, everywhere. And it's no different than you see in the Caribbean or wherever. It's the same thing. It takes about 300 to 400 years for that to change. A religious historian, a man who wrote the book, The Germanization of Early Medieval Christianity, Professor, it gives that estimate of number 300 to 400 years for a people to actually convert to Christianity, to become, or any religion, probably Buddhism, whatever, any kind of universalistic Islam, you name it. They usually retain their own beliefs and just dress them up in acceptable forms for generations before that finally gets completely forgotten. But then, of course, we have examples where the Icelanders or whoever preserved the original templates, and so you can revive them. And that's where this word comes into my estimation of the runes, is that they survived for a long time, but then they did eventually virtually die out, knowledge of them. And so then people had to go to books to learn about them. And that at that point you can talk about a revival, that there really was a kind of a deadness. There was an outer deadness. But the reason some people do respond to runes, even the look of them as being attractive, is what I believe is an atavism, something that's in us. But even if it's like, well, that's spooky, because most people who saw runes, like I said, only 1% of the population were ever literate in pagan times. But still people saw a stone or whatever, and they would see those runes on there and they'd go, oh, that's kind of taboo. You don't want to touch it. You're just going to be in awe of it. It's full of magic, it's full of some kind of power. A lot of times the stones were carved on stones. Those inscriptions were carved on stones, which were already kind of sacred stones, from megalithic times or from the Stone Age. So that's kind of typical. Sometimes you see a runic inscription on a stone, and then they'll see, oh, look, if you look real carefully, you can see Bronze Age, older iconography, symbols and signs that are on that stone also from earlier times. So they keep resacralizing this stone with new symbols, So that happens.
I know when you said the Caribbean stuff, I lately have been looking up Papa Legba. I know they kind of have a Peter reference, which I've been trying to figure that out. And I'm still trying to figure it out, but I know I was looking through the Papa Legba like artwork and stuff of him, with the top hat and the skull. And I'm like, well, how is that Peter? Which I know they have their reasons, but that's kind of like similar to what you're talking about with some of these connections, right?
Yes, all of them are that. I mean, that's, and it gets digested all the time, whereas something, for example, in the Caribbean, you'll have the slaves who then retained as much of their religious tradition as they could, but they interpreted these saints that were put up in front of them, in which they were forced to worship as their own gods and goddesses. But then as other things started to come into their world, typical of traditional people, like, for example, when the 6th and 7th books of Moses show up, they incorporate that too, It's not like when we think people, religious people or dogmatic people say, oh, that's not our thing. So we have to avoid that and keep pure and keep these foreign things away. Traditional peoples generally don't think that way. Just like the runes themselves, they are based on the Roman alphabet. I mean, they're not just invented out of nothing. They are Roman letters reinvented for Germanic purposes, reordered, renamed, resignified, and all sorts of things. But you look at the F rune, it's obviously based on the Latin F. The U is, Urus is just the U turned upside down. Thurisas, the third rune, is obviously some kind of invention because, again, Latin didn't have a letter for that sound. You know, and so each one was handled. It was probably, scholars hold, that the runes were invented. The system of the runes was invented by a single man and then spread from his school or from his prestige throughout all Germanic tribes fairly quickly, and retained their integrity of being 24 signs in this order with this significance through centuries of time. And that was probably relied on the prestige of a pre-existing cultic network of some kind into which this system was inserted, and upon which the prestige of which these runes proliferated.
And I know most of our audience is probably familiar with the Odin story with the runes, but when it comes to that story, I was just kind of curious to some of your perspective on it. All I know is he kind of hung upside down and saw them. What led to that exactly? Why did he do that? I mean, where did he get the knowledge to do that to begin with?
Well, we don't know that. I mean, you know, that doesn't give a backstory. It starts off, I know that I hung on a windy tree, nights all nine, given to Odin, myself to myself. And so it's a self-sacrifice to self because he is Odin. Typical Odinic sacrifice is hanging. We don't really know he was upside down. I mean, the text doesn't indicate that. That's just speculation. But an Odinic sacrifice, we know a lot about that because there's depicted constantly, regularly. One very, detailed description in one saga. Typically, he says, wounded by spear, geri undad, wounded by the spear. And what they do is they hang a person by the neck. Usually, there's old images of people being hung on trees, they're carved into some picture stones in Gotland, for example, and so they would hang them that way. And gods received sacrifice, human sacrifice, for what we would call today, or called traditionally in the recent past of our history, criminal offenses. If someone was committed crimes of any kind, they thought of them as the disharmonies in the divine order. So if a man deserted in battle, that was an affront to Odin. So he gets hung. Another person commits some kind of sexual peccadillo or something like that. That's an offense to the goddess. She will receive him in the earth, and so they will put him in a bog alive and press him down with wickerwork, drown him in the bog. That rebalances that crime by reallocating that energy to make them pay for their crime in honor of the god or goddess whom they offended. And so Odinic sacrifice was hanging in a tree. It's kind of interesting. The word, the name of the place, famous place in England called Stonehenge. Of course, it's a ancient megalithic site, pre-Celtic place. But the word, the name, is an Anglo-Saxon word. Stone, obviously, stone, it's not an English word. And henge is a place where things are hung. you hang the door on the hinge, right?
Yes.
It was used as a gallows for executions by the Anglo-Saxons as they were fighting against the Britons. Either their own deserters or the prisoners of war. Germanic peoples oftentimes didn't take prisoners of war. You see in the Edda, it reflects again an Odinic theme, wherein the god Odin, they engage in the first battle of the universe, of the Aesir against the Vanir. And Odin throws the spear over them and gives the opposition to the gods, you see. And that's what ancient Germanic warriors did, is they hurled a ceremonial spear into the opposition, and they would declare that all of those who were killed today in battle on the other side are sacrifices to the gods. They sacralized war. And that we carry that on, that Germanic ideal, to this day, because they considered battle, there's an Old Norse word for it, vapnadomer, which means weapon, judgment, like a court judgment. And that's how our legal system works to this day, an adversarial prosecutor versus defending attorney model, where you have trial by ordeal by proxy. That's how the courts today, to this day, work. And that's this Germanic mindset about how do you get to the truth through this adversarial process. So it's something that's an ancient idea that goes all the way back into those times. And that's the spear that Odin is sacrificed by, see, and then so that's how he's giving himself to himself. And at the moment, he doesn't die. He almost dies, apparently. But then at a certain moment, he takes up the runes. Nam mekup runar, I pandi nam. I took up the runes. A screaming, I took them. So it's tied to a vocal performance, and he just takes them in. He sees and apprehends the secrets of the universe, takes them in, falls down from the tree, and begins to carve runes, begins to express them in the world. One word leads to another word. One deed leads to another deed, he says, and so forth. And so this is like the sacred moment where it's kind of like the in 2001 where the monkeys on the, are using bones and things, and they touch that monolith, right? And boom, the next thing you know, we're in outer space. It's this just opening of the mind to the mysteries and what it does for the human mind and will.
Hey,
and that's what's being described there.
Hey, Stephen and Wham, if you would take the ship for a minute, I'll still be here, but my dog's 16 and he's having some health issues. I'm going to go adjust.
Oh, yes,
I'll still be listening.
To be taken care of.
Yes,
I wondered if that was what was going on there. I could hear him barking in the background. Hi, Stephen.
My dog is with me, but he's not barking today. That's good.
Yeah, well, I locked the cat out, so she wouldn't ask for food in the middle of this. First of all, I want to say to you, for me, I have been following your work for about 40 years, and I know that you have done a lot and have met a lot of people and have done a lot of things in your life, but way back in the I guess it would have been the early 80s, mid 80s, right after you published your book Futhark. Right. You and I did correspond a little bit. I still have your letters, and what I was really happy to be able to look at this book, because there's a portion of it, it's towards the latter part of the book, that explained to me kind of what had happened to me in the early, I guess it would have been the early 1980s, and this was before Futhark came out. I had an experience with a woman in a completely different context. I used to do the Renaissance festivals back then,
Right.
and at one point we had this was in Kansas City, Missouri, and at one point we had a troop of firewalkers come through, and they were actually not coming through just for the Renaissance Festival, but they were sort of just coming through the area. They were on tour of the United States or something. And
Mm-hmm.
so since they happened to be in the same place at the same time, they were invited to go do stuff at come and do stuff at the Renaissance Festival. And I met a woman there whose name was Kirsten, and she was of Swedish Finnish heritage,
Mm-hmm.
and she taught me how to firewalk. Now that was just how we got to know each other. And for some reason, she was going to be in town like for about a month, and for some reason she took a liking to me. Who knows why? We over a course of about 2 or 3 weeks, it's hard to remember because it was a long time ago, she basically gave me sort of a kind of a download of her family's traditions of the runes. She lived in this Darlana or
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and she told me, she gave me a series of techniques. It wasn't the 16 runes that you talk about in your book. It was actually the 24, but it was based on the way that she gave them. It was almost like she transmitted them to me. You know what I mean? It was like she insisted that I memorize a lot of stuff, that instead of writing it all down. And, I had to go through these mental exercises, very intense. And she taught me a series of techniques whereby to kind of energetically use the runes in I think in ways that sort of, I sort of learned how to use them before I really, in a non-linear way, I'll put it that. It's about the only way I can put it. And then she told me at the, because she had to travel on, she had to go continue on her tour. And she basically said, well, you've got this information now, and at some point it will open up. At some point you'll have some dreams and other stuff will happen, and you'll just, it'll just happen. And so I just sort of had to wait. And then it was like maybe a couple years later that Ralph Bloom's book came out, and the book itself I could care less about, right? It was like I looked at the book, mm-hmm. It was whatever, but I saw the forms again, you know what I mean?
Sure,
and it was like that just sort of, just the forms sort of started stuff in me.
Right. You can see in my book, I think I must go into it in some detail there elsewhere, that I wrote my first rune book in 1975.
Right.
And they were supposed to be, we'll publish this, big publisher wanted to do it. But then they came back and said, well, business guys say runes won't sell. That was 1975.
Right.
But I'm glad that didn't happen, as I think I point out at some point. It's like because I was working with the Armanin system,
Right.
And that kind of a thing. And so that's not really, exactly right. So the old man, as I call Odin familiarly, said, son, you got to go back to school. This isn't good enough. And that's typical of a relationship with Odin. You won't necessarily just say, oh, you want this? I give you that. You ask nice, I give you that. He says, no, you're here to serve a higher purpose. And if you're doing something wrong, the thing that I will do is I will thwart you. And then if you're thwarted and you give up and you quit, then, goodbye, you're out. But if you say, well, that's got to be, I've got to persevere. I've got to find another way. There's something that's intended by this failure is not just a rejection, but maybe a redirection. And that's exactly what it was.
Right. And then what happened with me was that, then your book came along, Futhark. And
Mhm.
that helped a lot. That helped me. It wasn't exactly what I'd been taught, you know what I mean? And it was a different style, you know, than what she had given me, but it was something, you know. And so I was able to begin a process of really starting to. It took a while though for me to figure out how to coalesce all this stuff together for myself. I mean, I did eventually go back to school. I did eventually, you know, study some German and Icelandic and Anglo-Saxon myself. You know, that's not what I got my degrees in because, you know, I also have other interests. But one of the things that then happened like maybe 3 years ago was that I ran into, and this, you talk a little bit about this in this book, I ran into Thomas Carlson's description of the Uthark. And I realized when I looked at that, and then I read your stuff about it, I realized, oh, you know, she didn't call it that. And I don't think it was that exactly, but I think that there was some influence of this school in what she was talking about, because what she talked about was there was family stuff that, you know, older traditions, but the numerological stuff that she used with me was very similar to the Uthark stuff. So once I was exposed to that, I was like, oh, that's what that was, you know. But although I've used Uthark for forever, you know. So for me, either one is fine as far as I'm concerned for my own work.
Yeah, well, Sigurd Agrell, the guy who did the Uthark theory back starting in the 1920s or thereabouts in Sweden, you know, is extremely influential. He's, you know, wrote a lot of books in Swedish and German. And so they, do you know my book, the Magian Tarok?
Oh, yes, I have it.
Okay, so that, you know, that's really Sigurd Agrell, the guy that did the Uthark theory. It was his work that book is based on. It's not so much my thing. I put more things in there and some more insights that he didn't have about Iranian things and so forth. But basically, it's his theory, and then you can see how he wrote a book on the tarot. And he used this same system to explain it, and it really that's where he really makes sense. His Uthark theory, you know, just has no. What happened there, I do believe, is if you just read like books on runology, and it'll have in there somewhere about codes, and one of the codes that was used sometimes was shifting the values of letters by one slot. And that's the way I think that the Uthark theory is explained. It's not really, there was no Uthar, there was no F, you know, with them moving to the end like a joker or something, but rather it was just a coded shift, perhaps. So that's could be the explanation there. But with that shift, if you look at the Roman things and the symbols that he teases out and connects it to the tarot, lining them up, it really makes sense.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, I have found it to be useful. You know, I mean, my own, you know, the technique that she taught me, I mean, even though it recognized all the forms of the Futhark, and she did talk about the order of them, you know, because the order is important in a lot of ways, sort of symbolically, you know, depending on whether you're doing triads or dyads or whatever, you know, that there are important symbolic sort of meta meanings and layerings that can come with all of that. She actually taught me, like I said, it was a more associative, visual way of working with them, almost a kind of a sigil kind of way of working with the forms, seeing them grow into each other and morphing from each other from central patterns and
iconic.
So that's sort of how I started learning about it all. One of the things, so you know, I guess what I was really happy about in reading your book here is I was like, oh, it's nice to see connections. It's nice to know, oh, okay, this really happened. This was real stuff. This was connected to something, I mean, that's all, that's important for me because it affirms experiences and knowledge that, I was given, and that that is useful for me in my life. I have had some really extraordinary dreams. I mean, Odin comes to me in dreams mostly. And so, because that's what I do most of my work in. And it was maybe a couple of years after she had left and given me this download that I had a series of dreams about him where I basically was told, I was shown a sigil, and I was told, when you see this sigil again, you're misunderstanding the sigil right now, but when you see the sigil again, you'll know that it's time for the next stage, whatever that was. So about 4 years ago, out of the blue, I was doing other things. I had a dream, and that sigil appeared again within an Odinic context. And that's when I started doing reworking about all this stuff. So it's like people who don't believe this stuff is real, they just haven't worked with it at all, so.
Right. It's a kind of thing that really requires a life of devotion to it and patience for it to work its way out. It's in there. It just has to find a way to make its way through the noise, and so I hope that in this book I show that what we're doing, we're groping our way, to discover this thing that in ancient times people could just, and the way you receive this information from this person is very much akin to the way in which runic knowledge was passed. It's best thought that such information passed from person to person, and it was exclusively men at that time for centuries. We know that because it refers to masculine only, carvers and so forth.
Right.
And so, women had their thing, men had their thing, and it was a warrior cult originally, warrior bands and things like that. And they got together at these places for religious festivals, but also that's where trade was carried out. It would be like a carnival, entertainment, everything. They come together from far and wide through the woods and so forth. They do these things. And around the campfire, the fellows that are interested in such things pass this information to their fellows who were generally poets, professional reciters, sometimes thought of as entertainers, but they weren't necessarily the way we think of entertainers, right? They were repositories of lore, but also of news, right? They would go from tribe to tribe and bring news from other parts of the world, and that they would be, of course, welcomed always into, even if the tribes were warring, if a storyteller, poet came, we're going to have him here because he's going to entertain, he's going to tell us stuff we want to know, and so that's how runes passed throughout these intertribal networks that were sort of the tradesmen, the poets, and so forth. But that was very much the kind of situation you described with your Finnish friend, who was at a festival type thing, a temporary thing, comes, passes information, and moves on.
Right, exactly. I mean, that's exactly how it was. I mean, it was, and and what was interesting was that she was not really concerned about us ever having contact again. It was kind of like, here's the stuff. For some reason, I feel like I need to tell you this. And of course, I was interested. And because I'm always interested in mystical or spiritual things, and especially then, I was really needing something. And, it's no matter what else I do in my life, and I've done a lot of other spiritual things in my life and have been involved with a lot of different types of communities, the runes stay with me. They just come with me wherever I go. They influence everything else that I do. They are the foundations for my connection to the planet, and to spirit. And it's an incredible, I feel like the ancestors are just sort of always with me, wherever I go through them. So I'm grateful for your part in that too, because you've played really important parts at certain periods in time, sort of connecting me with various types of different ways of looking at things and resources and so it's been really, you've been an important person in my life. So I want to say that to you. I think it's important that you think that it's important that you do that, and not only in terms of the rune stuff, but even though we're not talking about this so much anymore, some of your more recent work with Iranian religion, because I have always been a complete and total fanatic freak about Persian Iranian stuff. For whatever reason, I have no idea. I've always figured it must be past life stuff. So your book of original magic is like, oh, I need another copy. It's already worn completely. It's so I've I
well,
like,
that's we have this. There's an artifact. I have it in my book. You have my book on the Goths, the mysteries of the Goths. You can get it on Amazon.
Yes,
but anyway,
I do, actually.
there's a chapter in there, about the spears and the sacred spears with Germanic and the Goths and so forth. And they're these spearheads that have runes and tamgas on them, which are tamgas are Sarmatian. That's an Iranian steppe people. Family crests, if you will. They branded their horses with it and so forth. But it was their identity, and so you'll see the spear, and it has runes and a swastika on there, a Hakenkreuz thing, a trifoil, and then tamgas and so forth. And this would be a scepter. You see, it was not a weapon. It was a spearhead, but it was not used as a weapon. We know that because it's clean. It was never used in battle. But it's a scepter like of the king or chieftain, and on that appear the symbols of the people in his group, in his kingdom, in his entourage, And so we know that the Sarmatians and that's where the whole theory about the Arthurian legends being of Iranian origin. There was some, we'll just call them Sarmatians, that were fought in the Marcomanni Wars with the Romans. They fought with the Germans, the Germanic peoples, and they were defeated by the Romans. And because these Sarmatians were such cavalrymen, the Romans incorporated them into their army, but they don't leave them there in Central Europe, where it's now Czech Republic area. Rather, they send them to Hadrian's Wall to station them there. And then so people look at these Iranian myths and legends, the Nart sagas they're called, and say there's a lot of patterns in here that are similar to Arthurian stories and so forth. So there's a whole book written on it called Camelot and Scythia or something like that. But anyway, the Germanic peoples and these Iranian peoples were very closely related culturally. In fact, the art form that we so identify with the Celtic people and the Germanic peoples, these sort of animal forms that are kind of abstract looking, that's from Iranian art. That comes directly from Iranian influence. They came into Central Europe around 700 BC. I mean, they were there forever. Tacitus talks about them and so forth. And sometimes they war with the people, sometimes they're friends. Obviously all these artifacts show that, history shows that. The tribes get along, they fight. They get along, they fight. But that we know, hey, look at this art. That means the Celtic peoples of Central Europe, that's where the Celts are originally from, and the Germanic peoples, all of their art, typical art forms, are of Iranian origin, of steppe origin.
Steppe origin.
So there was a real symbiosis there, and cross. In fact, a lot of the mythic qualities of Yggdrasil, a lot of things of the cosmic tree, and a whole lot of other things. I wrote an article on the Germanic Iranian connection in the journal, comes out every once in a while, called TYR, Tyr, and there's in the 5th volume of that. There, I have an article in there about these connections, mythic connections, art connections, all kinds of connections between this Iranian peoples, these Scythians, Sarmatians, and so forth, and the Germanic peoples, which are enormous. In fact, they probably gave a lot of the really basic things. And the reason for why it's so profound an influence on the Germanic peoples is that the Germanic peoples don't really come into being as a separate ethnic group until about that time, about 700 BC,
right,
when these influences were all converging. And of course, ancient peoples had a tough time separating what they called Scythians from Goths. They kind of confused them. They looked similar. A lot of people here, a lot of sort of racist types and so forth, hear, the Scythians and Sarmatians, they come from the east and they're Iranian somehow or another. So they must be, swarthy Oriental types or something. No, they were described by the Greeks as tall, strawberry hair, blue eyes, green eyes, etc. They looked just like the Germanic Celtic peoples. They weren't at odds in appearance at all with those people. They were from a different place, and they spoke a dialect that no one, others couldn't understand. It wasn't really directly related. They're Indo-European. They are distantly related to Germanic and Celtic languages, but just another Indo-European group. But they got along well as they looked like they intermarried and so forth. The Huns, who were a Turkic people, but they interbred with the Goths very early on.
Right.
The name, the most famous Hun of all, what's his name? Attila. What is that? It's a Gothic name meaning little father. Atta is father in Gothic, the Germanic dialect of Gothic. The Gothic Bible starts off, in our Lord's Prayer, it starts off, Atta Unsar, our Father. So Attila is the way you say, is the Gothic names. They had all sorts of Gothic names, these Huns, and they were just people weren't. People think the way these 19th century type people, those people are different, and all this kind of ethnic conflict. No, there really wasn't that at all. In ancient times, they had conflicts, but they weren't based on ethnic identity. You know what I mean?
They weren't.
They had their differences.
Yeah, and they weren't based on, they weren't based on the kinds of things that we think about now at all. That's true.
No, not at all.
Not at all.
Just like the Battle of Clontarf. The Irish try to make that into, 19th century historians, blah, blah, blah. They try to make that into a story of the liberation of Ireland from the Norse oppressor and so forth. But at the battle itself, there were as many Norsemen on the Irish side and as many Irishmen on the Norse side. They were loyal to certain lords,
right, personally.
They didn't think in national terms. They might think in tribal or clanic terms, our family and who we're loyal to and who our differences are with and so forth, but they weren't national identities at all.
Well, they didn't have nations as such, like we have now.
No, but people reconstitute the past into the image of the present and think in terms of Germans and French and this and that and the other thing, and it just wasn't there. Just like France itself, it has a German name. The Franks were the founded the state of France, Francia, the land of the Franks. So
I used to tell when I taught, I used to teach the history of Europe,
that's cool.
a survey class. And one of the things that I would say about Northern Europe is like, you don't want to tell like the English and the French and the Germans this, but they're kind of all the same people. Sort of, I mean, there are different tribes and ethnicities in there, but, we have a lot of Germanness running around here. So Germanic types running around here. So, it's
well, certainly,
we're not talking about radically different people, like from an indigenous.
No, the radical differences came about for practical, reasons. They were more not like religious, like Jonathan Swift writing about the Lilliputians and people killing each other because they cut their eggs from one end or the other, and other nonsense like that. Yeah. And that's kind of what these ethnic animosities remind me of, just that, because people should ideally have their loyalties and their differences based on things that are much closer to their hearts than these abstract things which are so easily manipulated by politicians and priests and you name it. But if you're close to home, your life is close to home, and the people that you are your people close there, not abstractly what you're watching on TV and nonsense like that, but people close to you, personally known to you. That is the way it was, and the way it tends to still be, but we get confused very easily.
Yeah, we've a lot of people have lost the ability to just focus on more than one thing at a time. Very, very.
Stay home and sit still.
Well, yeah, actually, have an inner life, inner life with people that you're close to. Well, before I give you over to Jeffrey, there's one more thing because this is something that is part of your book, and I think it's an important part of your book because it's an important thing that some people will be thinking about that you've written about before. But one of the things that you do in this book, which I think is significant in the book, is that you work quite a bit to sort of, what's the word exactly? I don't know if liberate's quite the right word, but set the record straight about Guido von List. Mm-hmm. And so if you could talk a little bit about that, and explain briefly who Guido von List was. He's not, he's dead now.
He's not with us anymore, no.
He's not with us anymore, and why it's important to rehabilitate his reputation.
Well, we can rehabilitate. He was an honest mystic, a theosophist, and a poet and a writer and so forth, who had genuine spiritual experiences and so forth, but he wasn't a scholar, and so when he had his vision of the runes, he based his views on what he knew from his immediate traditions of Christianity and so forth, that the scripture, the written word, should holds great prestige and place of power. So he based a system on this poem we were talking about earlier, where Odin hangs himself on the tree and so forth. Then he proceeds to sing eventually 18 songs, and so Liszt based a runic system on that poem and on the stanzas of that poem, and had a sort of mystical view of language that was based on sound and sound similarities and so forth. And he was an artist, a writer, artist, so forth. He was a nationalist, but so most people were. He just died 1919. It was just at the end of the First World War. And if you read his stuff, which I read in the original German and so forth, and translated some of it, he was not what people, his own followers, immediately made him into after his death, immediately thereafter, because immediately after the Germans lost, the Germans and the Austrians lost the First World War under very sketchy circumstances in their minds, they got really pissed off. They got really angry, resentful, and hateful, towards the raw deal they got and so forth. And Guido von List was sort of reformed a lot of his ideas into this kind of more radical nationalistic viewpoint, which he didn't necessarily hold. He was fine with Jewish people. He writes nicely, about them and the traditions of Kabbalah and all of that, and that there was some kind of medieval symbiosis between the ancient Germanic peoples and the Jewish people, and they kind of cross-fertilized. He spoke positively about it, as well as Freemasonry. I have a little book, you can get it on Amazon, called Freemasonry and the Germanic Tradition. And it shows how a lot of Freemason rituals and all kinds of things are based on Germanic liturgy or legal procedures and so forth. And he wrote an article on that once and spoke glowingly of Freemasonry and such. But then after this, they said, no, Freemasons are terrible, conspiracy, international conspiracy, and all the anti-Semitism and everything. And his followers would kind of, when they republished it, said, well, the master didn't know, that this was all so bad when he wrote this. Oh, he wouldn't write this today, and so forth. So he was sort of moved in that direction. And unfortunately, a very unfortunate thing was that like people like Nicholas Goodrich Clark, see, like, oh, somehow Guido von List leads to Auschwitz, right? That somehow there is a direct connection between these two things, between Guido von List, the Germanic tradition, and Nazism, and there is not. I have a book coming out. I just signed or just got the contract yesterday on this subject. I won't go into it too much detail here, but it'll be huge, my biggest book of all time, 400 pages, almost 200,000 words on this topic that's kind of here, and it can be traced that these things are not, not connected really. But they get connected by people who see similarities. Of course, there were things in 1919 or whenever, the early 20th century, these people, these Nazis, for example, the men who were in the Nazis, was Hitler, Himmler, whoever, these people were born mostly in the 1890s. And there was a thing in Germany, and it has nothing to do with Nazism or anything, but it is a huge movement, still alive today, called the Reform Movement, the Reform of Life Movement. And there you have nudism and homeopathy, and you name it, it's a widespread thing. And these people were involved in that. Guido von List was an exponent of it, and all of these men who formed National Socialism were also children of this. This is why we hear about Rudolf Hess, the guy who flew to try to make peace with the English. He was like, all organic food. Hitler himself was an anti-vivisectionist, vegetarian, teetotaler. These were all characteristics of the Reform people, There were even Nazi nudist groups, and things like this. This kind of thing was widespread. That doesn't, it just is that these people were very much different than a lot of people try to make them out to be. It doesn't excuse their crimes, which were numerous and terrible, but but to understand what was actually going on in this culture is always the best tactic, is to truly understand what was going on.
Right. Well, it's always it's always best to understand rather than just to villainize. you know.
Right, because you can understand it, say that is wrong-headed. This is why it was wrong. This is where it went wrong. If you don't understand, you see what happened there, and this is a warning contemporarily, that if you start to get, like these people did, if you get into a bad situation, you feel you're desperate, like the Germans were after the end of the First World War, you know, had wheelbarrows full of cash to buy bread, things like that, starving, dying of starvation in the cities, so forth and so on. And you feel like somebody has done me wrong. Somebody's responsible here. And you are in an atmosphere where radical, crazy ideas have somehow become acceptable alternatives in your mind. Unreasonable, irrational ideas have become acceptable in your mind as acceptable solutions to your problems. You're on the road to hell, you know, because, you know, reason, logic, understanding, awareness is much better than just, I'm sick, I'm scared, I am threatened, I am scared of what's happening, and I am willing to do anything to make it stop or do something about it. And if I can identify if somebody, an enemy can be identified, you know, Hitler writes about in Mein Kampf, is I wasn't an anti-Semite. My father wasn't, I wasn't. I didn't give a hang about it one way or the other. He said, but then I wanted to create a movement. And to do that, I needed an enemy. I needed someone to focus on that way, you know, to bind us together. And the Jews were the only choice. There was no other, you know, choice for that tactic. It's a wrong tactic. It's stupid. But that's what that was. It was a conscious strategy.
Well, the Jews had been a target before, you know, they had been a target.
Well, they wouldn't have been, what things that happened couldn't have happened if, and I point this out in my forthcoming book, very in great detail or some detail, about the church, both Protestant and Catholic, were on a rampage against and had been for centuries, right?
Exactly.
So that when the Hitlerian kind of anti-Semitism came along, it was like nothing new. The Fritzes and the you know, so forth, just the ordinary German guy with low education and so forth, what we'd call a bubba or something here, you know, we're all preconditioned for that kind of thinking. For centuries, they'd been that way. The churches had taught them this, you know, that the Jews are the killers of Christ, blah, 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 and all these things that they had. It was all that. And so then the Nazis came along with a new rationale to keep up with science and whatever, you know, that kind of thing. But it was preconditioned. It could have never happened if Auschwitz could not have happened without centuries of church-based anti-Semitism, you know, which prepared the way for that sort of thing. And the Russians and the Poles and so forth were carrying out pogroms, you know, just prior to that, where they just went in and killed them wholesale in their villages and so forth. And so that was certainly, you know, nothing that is something that was connected to anything remotely Germanic. I come across so many people, Germanic enthusiasts, pagans, etc., so forth, and they express these sympathies for, you know, anti-Semitism, that sort of thing. And I tell them, I say, look, read the Edda. Do they ever mention anything about this sort of thing? No. Do they? For example, in my book about the Goths, outsiders, the Christians, or Roman Christians, identified the Goths and the Jewish people because they got along so well together. You know, they were like buddies. So it's a travesty as to what has been done to our tradition, both from the outside, which is expected because they will identify us as enemies because we're giving an alternative mythology. But then it is more reprehensible that we get this kind of resistance from the inside of this misunderstanding, which only makes us weak because it's based on error and things that are not true and things that are counterproductive. And so,
well, it's based on.
That's one of the things I try to be. I mean, I'm a trained academic teacher, blah blah blah, And so reason, at least in the old days, I don't know so much now, but in the old days it was like reason, logic, logical analysis of data, and coming to conclusions that are based on reason, not on emotion or wishful thinking or whatever. And so that's the way I try to write my books, to try to, each one is an attempt to teach my readers, not like I know better necessarily. Sometimes I do factually, but as far as the underlying attitude is, we need to approach problems from a reasonable perspective, and one that then opens the way to dialogue and discussion. If one just maintains a dogma that is irrational, there's no talking to that person on any side, anywhere. There's no point of discussion at that point because their minds are made up, and that's it. And that's not a healthy way to live, individually or otherwise.
Right. It's difficult to get along with neighbors that way. That's certainly.
I have returned my dog. I was just going to say he's been sick for a few weeks, so I mean he may not be with us too much longer, but he was sick, and then I prayed and he started doing better, but now he's kind of slipping back. But I've been with him for a long. Thank you. I've been with him for a long time. It takes a lot to make me cry, but I have been wringing tears when the last time he got sick. And he's doing it now, so it's probably good on a heart attack level for me to cry like that too, since I don't that much.
Right.
But I know with it happens. Welcome to Planet Mother Truck.
Yeah, I know.
Rob Zombie
we have a cat rescue. We have a huge number. My wife's like a cat lady. She's like a retired nurse. She takes care of them and does all kinds of medical things. And we live out in the country, and all the dogs I have are the ones that have been dumped on the road out in front of our house.
Oh man.
People just dump them out there.
Yeah, there's something
about. They got a lot of good dogs.
Yeah, there's something about the country. I know when I lived in a very rural area in Kansas, people would do that with their dogs too. They would just dump their dogs. Once somebody dumped a mom dog and 3 puppies, just dumped them.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And it's just like, how can you dump animals? I just don't get it. But I know
they're inhuman. These are cruel people. But one day sometimes we'd have like workmen over, work on something. And we tried to not do that so much anymore because next thing you know, people are because they see we have animals. Say, oh, you want to get rid of that cat, honey? Okay, I'm gonna take it over to those crazy cat people. And one day we were sitting there watching TV. We heard a door slam. We like to live in a place where there should be nobody around. And then they drive off, and we go out to look, and there's a cat like running towards our house. Help me! Help me! Just ran right into our house, and he's a great cat. But they didn't want him anymore. There was somebody that had worked on our house and just thought, well, here are these people. But I call it shirker nation. People shirking their responsibilities.
Yeah.
They don't take. And people throw a cat away, the person they'll be they throw each other away too.
Exactly.
And that's the kind of world I don't like. I want that. That's why I admire and study and admire and have sympathy and empathy for those people. I study these ancient peoples because they had a code of honor, behavior, and the connection to one another that was supernatural. I mean, it was like something we cannot. Most people today, loyalty is for the most part bought by, people are loyal to their company as long as they pay them or whatever. But these people were loyal because of the oaths they swore, and that makes a bond, that's just like, it's more powerful than blood in that culture. And there's a lot of myths and legends about warriors where the son and father are separated, and the son swears allegiance to a lord that is an enemy of his father, and the son and the father meet in battle, like man on man kind of a thing. There's an Irish version of Cahulan and Conla, and in Germanic world, Hildebrand and Hadubrand so it's apparently common. And they come and they say, okay, here we are. And it's the worst thing in the world you can do is kill your father or your son. That's like taboo. But we've sworn oaths. Which one wins the oath? And of course, that story never probably happened on occasion, sometimes. But the story, why it was a powerful legend, is that's that heroic dilemma, kind of like a Hamlet, where to be or not to be. I have this moral dilemma. I've got to kill. Of course, Hamlet is based on a Norse saga. And that's where he has his father has been killed by this man who has taken over his family and married his mother. So now he's my stepfather, but he's also the murderer of my father, who I'm honor bound to avenge according to the code. Yet he's my stepfather, which makes him taboo to kill. That is a moral dilemma, a Germanic style, see? And so you see all that. But that's these stories, where they come up. And that's when they struggle with these dilemmas about loyalty and obligation and so forth. It's a powerful culture. And of course, largely forgotten. We can romanticize or talk about it in a wishful term. But, that was real life. That's how. They didn't have welfare systems or governments to take care of them. They just had family, clan, and warrior band. That was the only way. There's one runic inscription that says, if you tear down this runic inscription, this stone, you will die a wretched death, meaning someone separated from any kind of human community, and you will be out alone on your own. And die a wretched, meaning lonely, unconnected to other humans, death, which is the worst possible thing, And that's why the knight errant, what's called we get the word wretch, but in German the same word comes out, Recke, which means a kind of a lone knight, which we romanticize in Westerns and every other kind of way in our sort of American mythology, but that's what that is, someone out on their own, the Lone Ranger, who's somehow broken the code, somehow an outlaw, but on his own. Now that is a superhuman individual who can survive and do things in any kind of meaningful way apart from human connection, So these myths. One of the books I'd like to write is just a thing on our Germanic heritage and things like that, would come up. That's the kind of thing where we see these things are still present in our mythic lives, and where they come from, which are very ancient and persistent. Nobody's telling us, oh, you need to believe this. Oh, let's sit down and do Bible study. Nobody's sitting down or studying the sagas or the Eddas, yet these myths persist, unaided by dogma and coercion. They're just in there, and they just come out. I think they're imprinted into our language, actually. So there's a lot of things.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, well, one of the books will be coming out with the publisher called Arcana Europa, pretty soon here, is a whole book on Odin. It's a detailed study of the god Odin, his origins, all of the things about him. It's very exhaustive kind of study. And since we talked about him so much here tonight, I thought I would mention that. That's coming out probably in less than a year, I'm sure.
Oh,
it's called Wodan.
Wodan.
Yeah.
Nice. I'll have to get that.
I originally called it Wozanas, but it's like too exotic sounding, and it doesn't go good on Amazon, a book thing. How do you ever see anything with an "es" and all these weird characters that you have to use to be precise when you're talking about some of this stuff?
Yeah, there's the marketing business.
Yeah, just the thing. The books has all that stuff in it. It's tough sometimes to publish, so we don't want to use those strange characters that confuses people. But actually, like you look at something, you see these words when they are spelled out with where they, instead of using an "es," special character for the sound, it's a "dh" and things like that. It makes the word so dang long. It looks unpronounceable without those symbols. Besides, again, you can learn to read those symbols. That takes about 10 minutes or less. You see,
definitely get a hold of that one for sure. I know one thing I wanted to ask you, just kind of get into your mind a bit about Loki. Was he always kind of a villain, or he really wasn't? And I know they mentioned him like in a hushed way, like they do with Christianity and Satan. It was never like that, was it? I'm just kind of curious to your perspective.
Well, obviously he was oftentimes in the company of the gods, right? In the myths, he's in the entourage. It's said that he and Odin are blood brothers, and the Edda mentions that, so forth. But just because someone is, in the group doesn't mean they won't betray you, right?
Yes.
And that's what he did. So, Odin cannot forgive him. He's instrumental in the murder of his son, his favorite son. And so, that's just, don't you say, oh, well, you plotted to kill my son, but who cares? No, that's not happening. Again, that's not happening. So that's where the villainy comes in. It's not so much that he's a trickster or he's mischievous. If we can use those skills to good purposes, then fine. But then when you start killing the family, and start plotting and getting other others, the blind god, to be an instrument of your malice, that's not cool. So you're out. So you got to look at it from not just like this is what this entity is. There's a narrative there, and that says more than just he's a static figure. So that's the key, really, to understanding Loki's not. Satan in the story of Hebrew mythology is a little different, than Satan in the Hebrew Bible is not the arch enemy of God. He's the prosecuting attorney. He's sitting right there with God. Book of Job, right? Jehovah and Satan are sitting there looking at this Job guy, and they're taking bets on, I bet I can break his face. I bet you can. He's my best man on earth. Okay, we'll see. Okay, try your best. See what's happening. So they're like drinking buddies up there. That's how it's described. So it's obviously not the Christians influenced by turn Satan into a kind of, like we were talking about the Iranian system, wherein the evil one, that is Ahriman, is bad. There's nothing good about Ahriman, in the Iranian devil, if you will. As you read some of my books on that. Well, because is disease good? Is disease ever good? Or is death good? You want death? No. You want life. You want is ignorance and stupidity. Those are the things that are evil in the Iranian viewpoint. Those are the things that are evil, are always negative, always bad, never beneficial, hurtful to man and beast and to nature. There are things in this world that are those things, and only someone who's blind doesn't see that. But see, Satan, as even described as been the devil in folklore and so forth and so on, he has a positive side. Of magicians try to get him to do this, that, or the other. He's not really. Only in the Western world, in Christianity, does the devil come out as a folk hero, because he's the rebel, right? He rebels against oppression. Because, again, the Iranians invented the story that the Hebrews recast as the Garden of Eden story. That is a complete Iranian myth that was retooled by Babylonian Hebrews, Aramaic Jews, and so forth. And they made it into something different than it originally was, because you see, the God that says, "Man, you need to be smart. You need to be intelligent. You will not die. You are immortal," et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is something that God doesn't want, right? He says, no, you're going to turn them into gods. And that's precisely what the good God in the Iranian world, Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, wants for mankind. Each and every individual human being is a potential God form. These are the farvashis, the spiritual part of each and every individual human, because the Iranian myth goes that all humans are incarnate spirits that volunteered to descend from the ramparts of the fortress of Ahura Mazda to come into this world to fight the good fight. But because of the wiles, of this evil force, which causes people to become confused, forgetful, and they lose sight of who they really are, and that they are immortal, good creatures, that they then become confused and start to do bad things because they don't know, and they are confused, and they are told that entity is constantly playing these tapes in your head. You are stupid. You are bad. You are dying. You will die, et cetera, et cetera. And when people or creatures are so prone to believe the worst, because they might feel weak or vulnerable, that they're preyed upon by these forces. That's the way that the Iranians say it's more pure, purely philosophical, whereas the Judeo-Christian mythology is a mix of things, and so there's inconsistencies. Remember, all of us who've gone through this exercise where you say, God is all-powerful, all-seeing, and all-good. Well, that doesn't compute, right? It never computes. If that's true, then why doesn't God stop bad things from happening? He's all-powerful. The Iranian view is that Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, is all wise and all-seeing, and so forth, and all good, absolutely good, but is not all-powerful. Mm-hmm. He has, or it, that's I misspoke, because Ahura Mazda is feminine, Ahura is masculine. Actually, that is a dyadic entity that is masculine-feminine. It's an it, really. And so it says, I need one element in this world, in this battlefield against these forces of ignorance, stupidity, death, and disease. I need something, and that is my farvashis here to descend with rational thinking, good thoughts, good good thoughts, good words, good deeds, to descend into the battlefield and fight with those weapons. And that is humanity. Every individual human being is one of these heroes. Now, linking that to the Germanic world, that's what these Valkyriur are. They are the ones who have chosen, and that's what the Farvashi also means. The ones who chose, the ones who volunteered to come into the battlefield. So it's a connected concept. That, again, one of those Iranian Germanic connections. But there it makes sense. See, humanity is necessary to earthly happiness, perfection, and goodness. Humanity is the key to that. And if humans came to understand that about themselves, it would be a much different world.
This is true. This is true.
You know, that we're not bad. We're not, so many people are trying to tell everybody they're bad. They're no good. They're evil, whatever. It still goes on very much in our consciousness. But that's not going to make anybody any better. It's like you have a kid. I don't have kids, so I devoted myself to my work. But if you have a kid, like I was brought up very well, always positive, right? Just you start to say bad things, discouraging things to children and so forth. It hurts them. It deforms their spirits, and so you got to keep things being positive and a good image of who you are and what you can be. And even if let's assume it's even a lie, in the sense that it's not as true as we would like to believe, it's still a more magical. And that's where the word magic, I guess, is an Iranian word. The whole thing of magic and making things happen, and taking power over our lives. That's a technology that was perfected by these people. That's why, for example, it's an Iranian thing to celebrate individual birthdays. They had sort of invented that. Because why? Because you will celebrate the birth of a person going on year after year as a celebration of that individuality, which is a radical concept. And that is precisely why the early Christians wrote a story about 3 Iranian priests coming to celebrate Jesus's birth, because it was the Iranian thing to do.
Right.
And of course, these magi, these were the greatest authorities of religion in the world, most prestigious kind of religious figures in the world. And so if they could write a story that says, hey, these Magoi think our guy is just okay, he's a great guy, then that gives us prestige by their connection. So that's the sort of secret behind that story.
Well, hey,
and the whole thing about the star, and all that's all Iranian kind of ideas there.
Hey, Stephen, we got we have 2 minutes left.
2 minutes.
I want to say I appreciate it so much. I've loved it, and I'll definitely keep an eye out for your new books and get you on again. I've loved it so much and enjoy talking about this subject matter a whole lot. So I just want to thank you for coming on the show, and I've really enjoyed it. And what do you have a website or any links you want to give out?
No, just you can get my books on Amazon. I'm devoting my next few years to finishing some projects. I'll be turning 68 in just a few days here, and you can't just drag it out forever, So I've been trying to get important things that I want done before time runs out to get that done, and so that's what I'm focusing on, and not so much in book sales and that, being a bookseller like I used to be.
Yes.
So everything is available on Amazon and such. So that's where any Stephen Flowers, Edward Thorson books there, they can find either name there. or if you look at my Wikipedia page, Stephen Flowers Wikipedia page. Whoever runs that, I don't run it, of course, keeps up with my publications very meticulously. I've noticed,
Yes.
Yeah,
So,
somebody else is a fan.
Yeah, that's right. I guess there's a couple of guys, I don't know them. I talked to one of them once, and I think he's a Swede. But anyway, they think they've done good. I went through it, and at one point I thought, well, there's something here. It's like, they mentioned, Edred's grandfather was in the Klan. Well, so what? Everybody's grandfather was in the Klan. You're talking about the early part of the 20th century. Somehow I'm responsible. So I pointed that out. I said, I can't be responsible for that. And so they took it out. It was just like this. And so I can't. There's not too much there that's incorrect. Some things, but not too many. Not like some people have terrible Wikipedia pages that are full of inaccuracies and incomplete, nonsense. But I'm lucky to have it. I'm glad that's there, and that's cool.
Well, and for both of you, I want to say, blessed Walpurgisnacht. I'm in upstate New York, and we have got a mighty wind blowing here tonight. So
the rock and the goat will be served tonight.
Yeah, making up for what both of you are missing.
Well, it's a rainy, it's a dark and stormy night here, but it's not that cold.
Right. I just been hoping my Skype doesn't go out, because literally the house has been shaking a couple times. So
yeah. Well, Skype is hopeless here. I have a satellite, so that's the only way I can get internet out in the woods, and that's not reliable.
Yeah, I've been there with that for sure, with the satellite dish in the yard to get internet, internet and all that stuff. Well, we appreciate it so much, Stephen.
Okay.
I'll be in touch with
thank you.
future stuff for sure. Take care, and thank you.
Thank you so much.
You too. Okay. It was nice talking to you.
Let's United.
Okay. Good night.
Radio. Good night, everybody. Good night. Thanks, everybody. See you next week. That was a good one. Don Webb and then Stephen Flowers. Boom. That's right. All right, everybody. Have a good weekend. And Loki's got his own Disney show coming up, so check it out.
Oh, there you go. Bye.
It actually looks really good. All right, bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. All righty. JoJo, hopefully I'm going to hang up, I guess, and hopefully everything's good to go. And that was definitely a good one, for sure. Good night, everybody. Have a good weekend.